Okay, let's itinerate a little, or as it were, drift along the river that Agamben has directed for us. So first, I'd like to read a rather fearsome word. Many years ago, a philosopher who was also a high functionary of the emergent Europe, Alexander Kochev, maintained that Homo sapiens had arrived at the end of its history and at the point had before it only two possibilities. At this point, at this point had before it only two possibilities: access to a post-historical animality incarnated by the quote unquote American way of life, or snobism, in parentheses, incarnated by the Japanese who continued to celebrate their tea ceremonies, devoid though they were of any historical meaning, period. Notice this notion of the post-historical animality incarnated by the American way of life. So that's exactly a reference to a larger phenomenon, which we see also, of course, in Heidegger, when Heidegger is speaking in his Black Notebook sometimes about America and Americanism. But interesting is this link also to this comment that maybe history will start again in 300 years, which I read a long time ago and didn't pay any attention to. Somebody mentioned it to me recently, and I thought it was impossible that Heidegger would say something that absurd, because I had got to thinking of when Heidegger speaks of history, I had been thinking not very much of Hegel, but mostly of his own manner of working, whereby he, in order to investigate the being question, or Seinfrage, he uses the history of Western thought as almost as the material for posing that question, because he has to somehow go to being. He tried to work out the way to not start with beings, but start with being instead. Which, okay, just in order to get some basic orientation, but also realizing that it's false, but nonetheless it's somehow, perhaps it's a dangerous perhaps. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. It seems to me, I can only say it this way: it's an invidia, or a prejudice, a yes saying, remembering that this is said by the donkey, according to Nietzsche. It's a form of stupidity, but we have to pick something. So this is the side that's on picking the history of the West as our highest object of investigation, and Agamben makes us think of museums in Europe where this question of what the past is has this form in the work of art, and the question is continually, what is our past? And therefore this is a question asked out of the present, and is the arm of the present. And to the extent one is sort of led by the arm into this abyss of the art world, in this sense, if it's the art world's only the past, it seems to be one is led into dreaminess and out of the present, out of reality. And then we have the question of whether this dreaminess can in some way, as in the works of Mishima, rival reality. And then even so, remember, for instance, this comment of the writer of the Crucible, that Mishima has a surreal style, but surreal somehow means it's almost like his style shows us more than we usually see in daily life, but not something false. So a prejudice towards starting with beings is a yes saying, which it could be starting with the beings as the interpretation of how the Zeinfrage works in any sense, in any reasonable sense. I claim it's not a false NVIDIA, not like an unfair, or in Zizek's terms, like maybe it's idiotic in Zizek's terms, but it's not totally idiotic. It has a sense to it. So if we start from this picture of what Heidegger is doing, then we see that this subject matter, and he explains this also in the book on the second book, the Schelling book on the metaphysics of German idealism, that he's always already thinking of the being question. But then here's what I want to add as the prejudicial avenue of invasion into that thought is, on the one side we could think of apophantic speech, which means basically just describing what is, or declaring something, declaring what is. So, for instance, all right, wait a second. What's the declaration said in contradiction to? That gives us a lot of clarity. It's said in contradiction to some kind of like action, like giving a command or something. A footnote that could refer to John Austin and so on, and Wittgenstein. But let's just get more basic. Just there's one thing which claims to say what something is. So if I say this is Yitzhak Rabin or something, and I'm pointing to like something over here with some yellow flowers on it or whatever, like, then somebody can say you've made a mistake, right? You've made a mistake. Or if I say, let's get a better one, more clear. If I say somebody is a dirty dog, so is that person literally a dog, or literally a dirty dog? They could say this is a failed apophantic speech. This is failed attempt to proclaim what the thing is there, and therefore it's a mistake. So this is the subject, just making the distinction between failed apophantic speech, which is meant to declare what's there and can then be ruled wrong, and the other thing, which is more like it includes giving a command or christening a ship, as we get in the John Austin thing. But it actually includes apparently much more than that. So the distinction between the apophantic saying what some particular being is, and then this region that's deprived of the apophantic, we could think of already almost as something close to the epeiron, this undetermined thing. And this kind of gives access to this problem of trying to go from beings in a particular investigation to, and then at the same time keeping the Zeinfrage in thought at the same time. Okay, so that said, Heidegger would seem to assume that this animality, this post-historical animality in, of course these are Agamben's words, and this isn't exactly the way Heidegger talks about it, but nonetheless he seems to be concerned with the same issue of the whether history can be begun again. And of course Carl Schmitt, we could superimpose over this at a different level. concerning whether one actually, as Leo Strauss says, Schmidt actually has to positively affirm the political. So in other words, it's not just that he's saying as a matter of description the political exists, but this fig leaf of the bicameral parliament and the vote and the other things is concealing it. So then therefore, by not admitting the real of the state, so like he has this thing like state, church, and economy, but the state subsumes all of it, and then the state becomes the name for the political, which then gets all those different determinations, like willingness of a group to do physical killing, but also determination by the very thought of the enemy. And in fact, there's some other determinations in there that he colors this concept of the political with. Let's look. So, you see that what's frightening there is this depiction of the end of history as a state that brings us into animality rather than brings us to what, according to Agamben or to Strauss or to Kochev or to these other sort of classical philologists of the tradition who attempt to keep contact with how these things were thought in earlier times. According to them, how people thought in earlier times the human being was supposed to differentiate itself from everything else has been sort of cut off, and it's ceased to play a role in political life. To use it in Schmidt's frame, although Heidegger wouldn't say it that way. He would say for this Dasein, for this now present Dasein, or for this. See, even that is just to start with is some being, but in the horizon of having in the background the question. So what's supposed to be the counter concept to this? So one, we have kind of this trivial example of the counter concept to the post-historical animality of the American way of life, quote unquote, which just sort of means just like utilitarianism, something like that. But in Heidegger, it takes on this meaning of the fact that our highest view of science has excluded the transcendentals and excluded the questions which open up, and which include all the so-called values, rather than the things that have already been made, the factum, rather than the past. They exclude all agenda or project, but doesn't agenda and project somehow stand within the factum, within the things that have already been made, so that it's again some form of this materialist versus egoist or versus freedom structure, or at least we can superimpose that idea on it. The more trivial view he gives, I think, is this saying that Japanese snobism is a counter concept to this, and this seems to mean some kind of quasi-Nietzscheanism. So it's like Nietzsche says, if a form, so say the tea ceremony that he mentions, if somebody should read a deep emotion into it and then see it as kind of the truth, then they do this thing that Zizek is calling the not totally stupid, or which I'm calling the prejudice, but or the invidia, but not false invidia, not unfair prejudice. because there's some kind of stupidity has to be, according to Nietzsche, involved if we simply absorb ourselves with the full intensity possible of this kind of remembering that Winkelmann thing about the noble simplicity and the quiet grandeur, Stille Grosse and Edel Einfach, I think. This is the notion of intensity, once again, intensity rather than, not in this sense of Deleuze or whatever, but in this sense of this Winkelmann idea, like that there were cultures that didn't know about the outside cultures, or they just regarded them, at best they regarded them as barbarian, gaijin or whatever, and they had a more Russian cataract effect because they're all channeled into the same flow point. It's more intense, but it has less variegation, right? Whereas we're in the time of being totally shattered ourselves against the notion, the Baconian notions of you can command by obeying. This notion that the human being can overcome and destroy what was once nature, so that nature becomes a moot concept. But at the same time, this only stands for things that are past, and it doesn't cover agendas and future ways of pointing, and then a huge congeries and thousands of caravanseries and much itinerating steerage in them is full with the books, is self-help books, as it were, to human beings on the whole, telling them how to conduct themselves. So in this atmosphere, the Biedermeier chair and the Third Empire settee and the Abercrombie and Finch lamp or whatever, this confused noisy screeching brakes and the hydraulics of the bus letting out as it tips the people off and so on, all kinds of things. One is then pointed to this possibility of the narrowing and the blocking out things, but it's in the existential mode because we're aware of it. So I think this is part of Dugin's thought, is this thing that originally, like, so for instance in Mishima he says, like, first Commodore Perry came in and forced us to open, and then Fukuyama says there was this so-called defensive modernization in like 1868. So like the first guy that suggested it right after Admiral Perry was there, Fukuyama says, was jailed, and I think he died in prison or something like that, who suggested, since the Americans are so powerful, he's talking about in like 1850, maybe we should adopt some of these Western ways of doing things. He was put in jail, but then like just a few years later, 8 years later, the Meiji Restoration happened, which I believe is 1868, and that was the beginning of all these westernizations, the first wave of westernizations, and then Mishima calls it the first time they were forced to look in the mirror of the West, and then after World War II is the second time. And then Ruth Benedict came out with this notion, who had done a big study on Japan, the chrysanthemum and the sword, came out with this statement, like, culture is personality writ large. So that was accepted. So this thesis was actually accepted by the Japanese, and you see Japanese scholars saying, yes, we were basically saw everybody else as barbarians, and we were enclosed, and then we became one culture. It stopped being the monoculture, became one culture alongside other cultures. So this situation can be contrasted with that silent grandeur and noble simplicity, which is Winckelmann sees in old Greek statues, especially, which are more Spartan and or Doric flavor. So that's two juxtapositions which are different. One is the intensity versus the lostness in terms of something shattered, broken into many, heart snipped out into many pieces of the people. But then the other issue is the history issue, in that actually, strangely enough, the heart is whole in the sense that the teaching, the technological essence is the heart, but we don't, it's so close to us, we mostly don't notice it and skip away from it. So there's a double kind of issue there in Dugan, when Dugan is appealing to the existentialist situation as a moment when one has to, so like for in his case, like freely choose to be a Russian and an Orthodox, and it just in the terms of this article, it's almost like, oh, that would just so what would the limit of that just being a snobbish act here, rather than being in the American, quote unquote American way of life? If this is the only juxtaposition we get is between those two choices, I see snobism we could understand as something like choosing something just because it's rare, maybe something like that, or just because it's uncommon would be a better way to put it, rather than vulgar. So for instance, Sir David Tang used to put his pocket of his suits on the wrong side, on the side that's not customary, just in order to not be vulgar. So we could see that this is not the of course we have the comparison of the tea ceremony, which is this I forget the details of. I think it's not that ancient of a ceremony, but it was developed somehow. What people find interesting in that, giving that example, is that it was somehow fairly recent, like conscious idea, but it's become somehow quintessentially understood as Japanese. But in the Nietzschean sense, this is much more like Nietzsche thinks much more as like somebody, like, so for instance Einstein. So it, just like I give a proof of this is Nietzsche talks a lot about not just Copernicus, but some other Polish physicists that he really thinks are great. So if I give the example of Einstein, it's fitting of the kind of examples one can deduce from kind of seeing Nietzsche's enthusiasm for certain figures. Jung had some kind of short meeting, Carl Jung had some kind of short meeting with Einstein, and then they asked him, like, what did you talk to Einstein about, what he thought about the things you're into? And Einstein said, well, you know, when a man is that preoccupied with his idea, there's nothing you can do. He didn't use the word preoccupied, I can't remember the exact word, but it's something to that effect. So this yes saying in a way is stupidity, in that it's, so one could say it's a stupidity if Einstein, had he had a discussion with Jung, would have been therefore more faceted instead of a one-sided man. So we could see Nietzsche's idea is a bit more difficult. The how does Nietzsche call that? The life's somehow the life-saving lie or something like that. So the lying to oneself and the stupidity amount to the same thing in this example. Um, but then we have another version, which is we'd have to think through with some examples from Heidegger, so that would be difficult. But this question in Dugin arises in the awareness of a great many difficulties, whether one can simply decide to be what from this perspective would be one form of life or one way of doing things alongside others, and then take a decision to it. It's a radical decision, and then I think the biggest thing that's strange about it is it comes in the perspective of these things we've been talking about. So especially in the just before this, when I was talking in the last talk about Giovanni Urbani, it's this abstraction and the taken for granted intensity of the certainty of that the sciences actually are that commanding of our life, of how we should understand all things, which it plays as the backdrop for the whole modern development. And therefore, in this sense, I think when we investigate these questions like what is liberalism, we treat a secondary phenomena, but one of the more important secondary phenomena, because we could also, on a somewhat similar level of suggestiveness and depth, treat economics, or treat the history of the rise of modern economics, which really only starts after Hobbes with William Perry, who first suggested laissez-faire. Or we could treat there's also other avenues in this kind of range. But the deepest avenue would be the question of this rise of the scientific way of grasping everything, which commands the agenda of the civilization, and thereby the planet, because the planet has to respond to it. Even if Dugin doesn't like it, he responds to it, and therefore he's in a way in this Schmittian situation and as Strauss has diagnosed it, he's speaking from within liberalism, though affirming something else.